Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'd like to have you just think for a moment of yourself as dead, okay? And I'd like to have you think about how you would like to have gotten to that state. Would you prefer that you got that way because you had your head chopped off with a sword? Or would you prefer that you got that way because an arrow pierced your heart? Or would you prefer that you got that way because a cannonball ripped through you and tore you apart? Or would you prefer that you got that way because an airplane flew overhead and dropped a substantial bomb that not only blew up you, but blew up a lot of people? Or would you prefer to be dead because there were gas canisters that were released, and that's how you were killed? Or would you prefer to be dead because of a nuclear explosion, an offensive nuclear explosion, where an enemy chose to detonate this device? So which would you really prefer? How would you like to be dead? Now, in a sense, that's what we're talking about, because it doesn't really make too much difference, in one sense, how you got killed. Okay, dead is dead. But in another sense, there is a huge difference, because there are degrees of evil. And so whether you were killed with the sword, or whether you were killed with the bow and arrow, or whether you were killed with the bullet or the cannonball, all of these things are gradations. And when you get to nuclear warfare, you not only kill people, you kill everything. And you don't kill it for right now, you kill it for generations to come, because of the damage that it can do. What you're releasing, you're changing the nature of matter. Now, in the realm of religion, there are few of the sacred writings that call for absolute pacifism. There are hints of pacifism. But all of the sacred writings, whatever the faith tradition might be, always tries to minimize the evil of war. They say, if you have to fight, if you have to defend yourself, do it in a more humane way. Now, obviously, killing is not humane. But again, there are gradations. And there are some ways that are not nearly as terrible as another, just because of the sheer scope of it and what it actually does. I grew up in the 50s, where the Russians were going to bomb us any day. And so in school, we used to have these air raid practices where we would get down and crawl under our desks. And when I used to go to public buildings, there were civil defense signs, and that meant that if you went there, this was actually an air raid shelter, a bomb shelter, and also there would be food stored there, food and water. And as a kid growing up, every time I went to the courthouse, every time I went to any major municipal building, I saw these things. And so I grew up in that era, and then Vietnam came along about the time I turned 18. And so I wrestled deeply with how I should relate to the whole concept of war. And I think it is extremely important that we talk about nuclear war because of the magnitude of the potential of its destruction. But I don't think that we've served ourselves well if we just talk about nuclear war and say, well, but all other kinds of war are okay. Or as long as it's not weapons of mass destruction, as we're only killing a few people at a time in little skirmishes, that's okay. But if we kill vast numbers of people, I think we need to be wrestling with the whole concept of killing each other. And that's a little more complicated than one might think. So I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist, and the Seventh-day Adventists typically urged their youth to register for the draft. This was back when we had the draft. To register that we would go to the military, but we would go as non-combatants. So we wanted to serve our country, but we wanted to do it in a way that didn't take life, if we could avoid it. So typically, Seventh-day Adventists went into the military as medics, and so they would not carry a gun, but they would render help to those who were wounded. And I wrestled with this quite a bit. I signed up as a non-combatant for war. And then I began to wrestle with it even more, and I began to understand the politics that's often involved and the machinations behind conflict. And I decided Vietnam was really an immoral war. The Catholics have probably done more work on the concept of war than any, at least, other Western religion. And the Catholics have developed what they call the just war theory. And the just war theory says that there has to be real reason to go to war, and then the war has to be prosecuted with certain limitations. You can't go out and, for a small provocation, just wipe out an entire people. You know, there has to be a proportionality to it. It has to be defensive in nature. And so they've spelled this out very, very clearly, and it's well worth studying Catholic concepts about just war theory. I would not use the word just war because I don't think any war is just. Okay, there's injustice in every war, but I would say there may be some types of defense that is justifiable under the circumstances. It's not just, but it's justifiable. But I think that we need to always have as our default setting pacifism. We should always, be in the notion of pacifism and only override that default setting if we have to. So as I studied the Vietnam War, I could have gotten out of the draft simply because of the fact that I was a theology student preparing for ministry. But I thought, no, that doesn't really work, because how can I counsel young people who face the draft if I got out of the draft? Because I was a minister. So I said, forget that. So I gave away my ministerial deferment. And I said, I'm going to face this like everybody else has to face it. And then I wrestled with it more, and I came to the conclusion that the Vietnam War was an immoral war, and that I couldn't, with a clear conscience, participate in it. And so then I had to go back and say, I'm an objector to war. I'm a conscientious objector. Now, that was a little more complicated because I'd already signed up in another boat. I had to switch boats. And so I wrote to my draft board. I explained my rationale. I wrote to a number of people who wrote letters on my behalf. And every person who wrote a letter on my behalf disagreed with my position. But they wrote letters to say, we think he's wrong, but we at least think that he sincerely believes he's right. And therefore, we support his right to be wrong. And so the draft board did give me the change of classification. And so I became an objector. And what that meant was that if I were drafted, I would have to do non-military service, like go to work in a hospital or work for the Forestry Commission or whatever it might be, and I would have to do a longer term of service than if I had actually been in the military. The thing is, I'm now many years past that. That all happened more than 40 years ago, but I still wrestle deeply with the whole concept of war. Because I think that it is absolutely staggering that people of the brilliance that we are could be so stupid as to kill each other as a method of resolving our differences. And it's stupid whether we use bows and arrows, or whether we use swords, or whether we use guns and cannons, or whether we use chemical weapons, or whether we use nuclear weapons. We're only talking about the grades of stupidity. And surely, motivated by the counsel of our sacred writings, we should be smart enough and moral enough to come up with alternatives to not only nuclear warfare, but warfare completely. And it's my hope, and it would be my prayer, okay, that we as a people could make that change. Thank you.